Okay, let's talk about social knowledge. How do we learn things about our society? Right. So on one hand, sociologists would talk about how we're socialized into our given society. Right. That as we're growing up, we literally internalize the norms, ideas, attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, habits that are around us. Now, certainly, there's a sorting process, and some degree of individual agency or maybe personality causes us to maybe be more attached to certain things than others. But no doubt, if you were raised in an entirely different context, you would be a very different person, and that would have fundamental influences on your personality. Right, those things don't just come from your genes; they come from your social world as well. But I don't want so much to get into a kind of nature nurture or nature culture debate here, so much as to talk about some of the ways in which we take in new information and are able to, in many cases, change what we know about society and the world around us. So, on one hand, we can talk about two main stages of socialization. So, primary socialization and then secondary socialization. Primary socialization happens when you're young. And that is where you're basically just absorbing the facts, the social facts of your world as a kind of taken for granted reality, if you will. So, when little kids ask their parents why something is what it is, and you sometimes you just give them a name for it, and that's enough for them to be like, okay, that's what that thing is, right? I mean, language acquisition, for example, is a primary example of this. But once you reach the age where you can start taking the perspective of others and critiquing, like, why do I think what I think? Usually begins in adolescence. You're now into secondary socialization. And well, almost any given member of the same society will have a similar primary socialization, right? At least around very key principles, right? So if you grew up in the United States and you bump into somebody else from the United States, you tend to assume there's a kind of common knowledge that you both have, right? They understand some basic rules about democracy, private property, freedom, individual expression, perhaps. Even simple things like the basic traffic signs and laws. Green means go and red means stop. You don't really question whether somebody knows these things. You know that if they're a member of your society, they have that common stock of knowledge that you have, that they acquired in primary socialization. But if they're an engineer and you're a nurse, well, now there is secondary socialization and more individualized stocks of knowledge beyond that common stock of knowledge, right? So people can develop expertise in different areas. And so social knowledge, beyond what we might consider common knowledge, social knowledge is not evenly distributed in a society, right? So some people are mentored into different ways of thinking and different sets of knowledge than others. Some of that certainly could be class conditioned and based on educational opportunities. So the sociologists would tend to look at that. So how the different distribution of knowledge in a society can lead to knowledge gaps, to inequalities. But a psychological social psychologist will tend to emphasize the idea that knowledge comes in schemas. And this is also a very useful idea. And that's that, our brains, yes, they're databases of social knowledge about our society, but not every fact is held, sort of in rows and columns, right? Like maybe it would be in a computer or something. Instead, we have these webs of connected ideas and knowledge in our given society. So if we want to talk about, say, dating rituals or marriage and weddings, right? You have a lot of connected ideas about how those things should work. And there may be some common stock, general knowledge from your society that people you run into will share with you. But depending on how built out these different schemas are, these webs, you might not have identical schemas, even about similar concepts. If you think about something a lot or it's a part of your daily life, your schema in that area will be more dense, more built up than something brand new to you. If you, for example, have you ever had that experience where somebody comes from another culture and it's hard for you to remember their name? It's because you don't have a schema that causes those sounding syllables to connect in your brain as easily as the words you would commonly hear in names that you might hear all the time. Or if you're watching a new sport that you'd never seen before, it is kind of hard to understand the action going on, to get excited about it, because it just looks sort of like chaos to you. If you don't have enough of a basic schema, it's actually harder to keep learning about that thing, right? So it's sort of a basic principle of learning, right? The more you learn about something, the easier it is to learn more about that same thing. So schemas, when you are approached with a new situation, then you are faced with the question of, do you assimilate this knowledge or do you accommodate this knowledge into your schema? And these are two different principles that are very important. So with accommodation, you actually have conceptual change. You allow your schema to shift, to be altered based on the new information you're learning from your social world. Whereas assimilation is the situation where you keep your existing schema intact. And when something you encounter is different than what your schema allows you to think or what you would have thought before, rather than changing your schema, you change the information or your interpretation of that information so that it kind of fits in to the schema you already have. Right? So maybe you have, maybe there's some gender bias, right? Or that you think, okay, men are better at conceptual spatial thinking and therefore being engineers or architects or something, right? And you have some gender idea about that skill in your schema. And then you come across a very talented woman who's an incredible architect or engineer. And so then you have to decide, are you going to accommodate that new information and have some cognitive flexibility and say, okay, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe women are just as capable. Maybe I need to think differently about this gender stereotype in this area. Or do you assimilate the information? So you actually reinterpret what you see. Well, she's just unique because she actually thinks more like a guy, or she was raised just by her dad, or you find some reason to say, oh, that's why. And so rather than changing your schema, you can change your interpretation of the social information to assimilate or fit it into your existing schema without having to change it, which accommodation would require, right? So, and we do this in a lot of different ways, right? One of the reasons that we'll often assimilate knowledge rather than accommodate our schema is we have a lot of cognitive biases. I'll just give one example, confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is this process where if we see something that matches our pre-existing beliefs, then we're more likely to notice it, right? And there's a degree of priming that comes to this too. So like maybe you buy you buy a new to you car. It's a used car, a few years old. And after you buy that car, because it was a good deal or whatever, maybe a friend sold it to you, all of a sudden you start seeing that car everywhere, right? And you think, wow, this is a much more popular car than I realized. Well, no, you're just primed to notice it more because it has more relevance to your life, right? So say you have a political ideology or a religious ideology, and then you see something that contradicts that view that you already have. You're much more likely to dismiss it. But then if you see an example of something that reinforces your belief, you're much more likely to notice and remember it. And then it then reinforces that schema that you already have and makes it more difficult to change. So once you have really crystallized beliefs around certain things, really sort of set schemas, it's not that they're unchangeable, but they do tend to retain a kind of persistence over time. And so the more ingrained your schemas around certain areas are, the less likely you're going to keep changing. But if you want to be, a lifelong learner and somebody that has a lot of cognitive flexibility and can grow and see new and diverse perspectives, you want to really try to recognize these confirmation bias, but any cognitive bias, and challenge it, right? What would be so bad if you altered your schema to actually accommodate information that widened your perspective on things, rather than reinterpreting information or recognizing and disregarding information based on whether it already supports or challenges your existing beliefs?